So this is a subject that I wasn't planning on doing a video about, but people people would say the phrase oil war, and I would immediately think, I don't know what you guys are talking about. So I decided to make a video about this because not a lot of people know about Venezuela. They don't know the history of Venezuela. I know a bit of history of Venezuela. Fun fact, I think it was my Christmas video where, wait, maybe it was before that. I don't remember. But anyways, I was on a video and I was actually talking about Venezuela, and Venezuela actually plays a big role in the future of the United States. Um, in a few different reasons, but this completely came out of nowhere. And one of the things people have said is it's an oil war, and well, that's all that people have sent me. It's an oil war, and I decided to look into it, and no, we're gonna look into it. So, a little bit of backstory about Venezuela. That, as far as I know, in the middle to late, until middle or late of 1990s, Venezuela was actually a democratic country. In fact, it was so democratic, it was a democratic utopia. And I got ChatGPT over here. Let's see if ChatGPT works. Because it was working the other day, but it looks like it might be having problems. My internet's working, everything appears to be working, but why is it not loading? I had to cut there. I had to reset Atlas. When it works, it works, but when it doesn't work. So we're going to go through here and read this. Oops, wrong thing. Atlas. So it said, what was Venezuela like in the 1990s? It says right here, Venezuela used to be considered a miracle country until the early 1980s. It was one of the only 4 Latin American countries certified and all this. So here's a picture of how it was in the 90s. It says, a decade of economic stress, political upheaval, and social frustration that set the stage for major change at the turn of the century. Economy and daily life. Oil-dependent economy in trouble. Venezuela was heavily reliant on oil exports, which made up a huge share of government revenue. When global oil prices dropped in the early 1990s, the economy weakened significantly. Banking crisis in 1994. A major banking collapse hit the country. Dozens of banks failed. The government had to take over many of them, and the crisis cost the economy a large share of GDP. High inflation and falling living standards. Prices were rising rapidly through the decade, and poverty climbed as wages lost buying power. By the mid-1990s, many Venezuelans were poorer than they had been a decade earlier. Growing disillusionment with... Now, this is where you kind of see the United States in relationship to Venezuela. Growing disillusionment with traditional parties. Like I said before, Venezuela was a very democratic utopia. Democracy ran everything. It says the old political system, dominated by 2 major parties since 1958, the Punto Fijo, I guess you'd say that, pact, was widely seen as corrupt and ineffective by the early 1990s. People increasingly distrusted mainstream politicians. That's what's going on right now. Coup attempts. There were 2 attempted coups led by then Lieutenant Colonel Hugo Chavez, one in February 1992. Interesting. 1992, February, And another year later that year, I wonder what day that was. I know it comes from Wikipedia, but I'm gonna put that in my notes, my stickies, so we can bring that up again. Uh, Reflecting deep discontent within the military and population. These failed but boosted Chavez's profile. Social protest and instability. Street protests, strikes, and public demonstrations were common through the early and mid 1990s as people reacted as economic hardship and government missteps. So what you see here is you're seeing the disillusionment happen in real time at this point. You got the people and you got the government. Who makes the rules? When the economy fell, the government had to take control, while the people believed they were in charge. So you have a imbalance of power right there. So it's no longer a democracy, and you can see the writing on the wall from the as late as the 90s, possibly even from within the 80s. Rise of Hugo Chavez. After his coup attempts, he gained popularity among voters, frustrated with the status quo. By 1998, he was elected president, marking a major political turning point that ended the country's post-1958 party dominance. So this is when it became authoritarian, even though it was democratically elected. And that's interesting, actually, because from coup attempts and someone being, that would be a change of regime, but you would also have people voting for you doing the coup. I'm not. That kind of happened with Ukraine in what was it, 1917 or 1918, when the White Army took over. Wait, no, it was the Red Army that took over, and it was Lenin, and then people, I believe they were able to vote for the Bolshevik party, and eventually they did win. But that was a whole thing. That you had the White Army and you had the Red Army. That's what I'm kind of seeing in this. Disillusionment and hope for change. Many Venezuelans felt that elites had failed them. The banking crisis, inflation, and unemployment fell to the moon that radical change was needed. Increasing political polarization. Supporters of the old parties and new voices like Chavez clashed over how to address the country's problems, foreshadowing the intense politics of the 2000s. Now, this is also an interesting thing about the United States. If you want to get rid of the old parties like Democrats and Republicans, would be the old parties, and the new voices like Chavez, which would be someone who comes later to address the country's problems, you wouldn't have a single person. To make that work in the United States, it wouldn't be a single person. It would be a already established system in the background of the United States. And I'm not talking about the elites. I'm talking about a government that's already there, that's really stable. It's, a few will survive. Not the majority of federal programs. Well, not even federal programs. It would be federal government agencies would survive. So it wouldn't be one person. It would be government. So what would happen in the future in the United States is what they couldn't do due to the circumstances that Venezuela had. So in the 1990s, Venezuela was economically struggling, politically unsettled, and socially restless. A reliance on oil made the economy vulnerable to price shrinks, the banking system collapsed mid-decade, and ordinary people faced inflation and declining living standards. Deep distrust of traditional politics and rising inequity set the stage for Hugo Chavez's rise to power at the end of the decade. Remember, this was still a democracy when they voted him in. a shift that would transform Venezuelan society in the decades to come. So, we see a lot here about banking and we see a lot about oil. So people would think, well, oil war. That's not actually true. In fact, I don't understand what's going on. Like I said, it came with no warning. At least when Iran was bombed by Trump, we at least knew something was going on a few days before. Now, I didn't point them out because Israel and Iran are not things I care about. I don't care about Israel. Iran, we talked a bit, but not really directly about Iran. We talked about the history of Persia, but not anything about modern day Iran. Well, outside of, the Muslim, a little bit of Muslim, the Islam religion. We talked a little bit about that. But anyways, so it's not an oil war. I don't know why I'm flashing right now. Maybe it's this lamp. I can't even reach it. It's too far. So my face is going like red and white. I've noticed that. So, yeah. Anyways, so the truth of the matter is Venezuela has been under heavy sanctions for their oil forever. And I'm going to see if ChatGPT can express this. Because it's one thing is going on to prevent something. It's to stabilize their economy, but when you do that, you create more corruption. Let's see if ChatGPT can pull that out. But before I do that, how do I type this? So I'm curious of what happened in February in Venezuela. I don't know what day that was. I'm not going to read through this. So if you're interested, you can pause. So it was a Tuesday, so February. What was the what would you call that? That what was the full date in one sentence? February 4th, 1992. Now, I did see that up here. February 4th, 2022. I'm thinking, isn't there February 4th? Maybe it was February 7th. You know what? Something just came to me. Yeah, it'll be February 4th, but it's not tied to this. It's just that date. That date relates to something else, not to this. It has nothing to do with this. So February 4th, 1992. All right. So I'm gonna have ChatGPT explain the sanctions here on this next one. And it was for the oil, and I'm sure it was to stabilize their banking. I'd imagine so. Sanctions are so The U.S. has imposed sanctions, most extensive set of sanctions, starting on in 2005, 2006, but dramatically expanding up to 2017 in response to political repression, undermining democratic processes, human rights abuses, and corruption under Nicolas Maduro's government. Blocking Venezuela's access to U.S. financial markets, targeting Venezuela's state-owned company PDVSA in the central bank. Yeah, I figured it would be targeting the bank and the oil companies because that's what we were seeing before. So the sanctions, I would imagine, would stabilize the economy where it could build back up. That's what it. That's based on all this information I see. That's surface level that I can pull out of that. Preventing them from receiving payments for oil exports and restricting NAFTA exports, which is a NAFTA is a isn't that what they made Agent Orange with? NAFTA? I gotta. What is NAFTA? I'm pretty sure it was. I know you can't see this. It's a crucial feedstock for producing gasoline, jet fuel, and various petrochemicals, acting as a bridge between crude oil and finished products. Used to make plastics, solvents, adhesives. They used it for a lot of stuff. I know a little bit about NAFTA because I've heard of that. I'm from Southeast Texas, so you hear things like that. Petrochemical industry is big over there. But yeah, we're preventing them from receiving payment for oil exports because they're so big that it would go out of control. But I don't understand. But I can see how that wouldn't. I mean, on the surface that works, but I'm sure that would lead to more corruption. Of course, it did lead to more corruption. Sanctioning shipping companies, oil tankers, and relatives associated with Maduro for enabling the regime's operations and corruption. But that's the thing; it would create more corruption. Where else would you get the money from? And they did say that Maduro does narco trafficking. And yeah, the DA was involved in all of this that just happened recently. So yeah, you're gonna get more corruption. So when you try to solve one problem, you end up creating another problem that you can't control. So you see the problem there. And Venezuela was, I mean, with the material goods and all that, the mentality, the democratic process, all of that, it looked like it was fine on paper. It looked like it was good on paper. A democratic utopia, as I've said before, a miracle thing. So, but as you can see, a fully democratic government is not the way to go. The United States isn't a fully democratic, it's a republic. So yeah. So let's read this. It says visa bans and asset freezes on officials accused of corruption and human rights abuses, which creates more corruption, more officials being corrupted. It creates a whole thing. The EU has also imposed sanctions. Democratic erosion, human rights violations, and repression of civil society. Here's the problem. This isn't a reading all of this. I gotta read it between lines because it's not saying a lot here. If you're talking about democratic erosion, it was because of the system they had in place for democracy. So it's kind of correcting itself. But you got all these other countries posing sanctions because it has democratic erosion, when democracy was the cause of their problems. And it has cascaded into we haven't talked about this word yet, but I know that I need to talk about it. I put it here. I have it in my notes. And you might have heard that term used before with Trump a few months ago. Well, several months ago, actually. So let me go through here. Why were they imposed? Political repression and democratic backsliding. Like I said, democracy was their problem. And they got punished for backsliding on democracy when it was the system trying to correct itself. But they had all these governments. I don't know what to do in that situation. Allegations that Maduro's government undermined elections and democratic institutions. Human rights abuse. Sanctions target eventually lead to violence against protesters and repression of political opponents. Corruption of narco-trafficking concerns. The U.S. essentially had labeled parts of Maduro's network in the so-called cartel of the Suns linked to security forces as narco-terrorists or criminal. Right, because you took the money, you put sanctions on them, and on the officials, and now they gotta get money in other ways. So you breed corruption. Corruption breeds corruption. And we see that in this case. Now, I don't know what their drug trafficking was before this happened, but I imagine that it got a lot worse once these sanctions came into place. Economic pressure to spur political change. Blocking access to revenue streams like oil income and assets in U.S. banks was intended to weaken the government's ability to sustain itself. Okay, let me break this apart, because I think I did before I read that sentence, but it's getting really compressed here in the language. Blocking access to revenue streams like oil income and assets in U.S. banks, which makes sense if you have a central bank. It can't do business, it can't do currency exchange with the United States to have the banking system get out of control, or have the oil income get out of control like it was in the 80s. So it's the United States is acting as not a regulator, but kind of like it's like a containment vessel where it can't get out of control and it can't self-regulate, because if it tried to self-regulate, it will go out of control. So it says it was intended to weaken the government's ability to sustain itself. The problem with this statement was intended weakness to government's ability to sustain itself. Whenever you target a government in that way, you breed corruption. You get more backdoor deals. You get more money coming in that can't be traced. You get a bunch of that stuff. You get a bunch of corruption when you do that. If that's your intended purpose, that's what happens. I would rewrite that and say it wouldn't be the weaken government's ability to sustain itself. I would say it would weaken the ability where the country won't go out of control economically, which caused its problems in the 80s to 90s. Which I don't know why we would get involved with that, because like if we were to take all that stuff away, then what threat does Venezuela pose to, like, does it really affect us? Well, I guess you would have. I don't know. I think it's just more about geographical placement because of the oil. If the oil is that important, then I could see how that might play into the United States can't regulate the price of gasoline if you don't control your neighbors' inputs and outputs. And I'll talk about that. How they affect Venezuela and the region. Oil and finance. The oil sector, Venezuela's economic backbone, has been one of the central targets. Blocking oil payments, payments processing, and oil sector shipping has drastically reduced revenue. Makes sense. With limited access to international financing and shrinking oil market, Venezuela's economy suffered deeper contraction. Some economists link sanctions to a drop in government income and a social service funding. I mean, why is it some? It would be. Are you blind? Of course, the sanctions had a drop in government income because of the oil. The sanctions on oil, of course. If that was their biggest export, you know. Recent U.S. actions have involved seizure of oil tankers, pursuit of vessels that try to evade sanctions, and even blockade orders on sanctioned oil tankers near Venezuelan waters. Tactics meant to squeeze revenue, but controversial under international law. Now, I will say this. I'll add that to my notes too. These were things I was really going to talk about, but because they're my notes, it makes me address them later on. So I don't skip over them at a later time if I do. While sanctions officially exclude humanitarian goods, food, medicine, critics say broad financial restrictions can still impede imports and investment, contributing to shortages and migration pressures. Analysts debate the exact scale of this effect. Legal standing. So there's nothing else in here. So Venezuela sanctions nutshell. Sanctions are penalties aimed at specific persons, companies, and sectors, mainly oil and finance. But they're not aimed, in this particular case, even though you're aiming for these small things, you're pretty much aiming for the entire country in a certain way where you know it can't self-regulate. The U.S. has led the effort, but the EU has also participate. They were justified as responses to authoritarianism, corruption, human rights abuses, and narco trafficking. I would say it was more of the democratic system and how it failed. I guess they won't put that on a. I don't know where it gets this information from. It says Wikipedia, but there could be others. I mean, ChatGPT can get information out of a lot of things, but we're here to break things down where we aren't looking at, pro-liberal, pro-democrat, pro-conservative, pro-republican. We're not even looking at libertarianism. We're just looking at it and we're seeing what fits, what makes sense, and it's not always what it says on the screen. So I would say it was more about their democratic things, but if you focus on more heavily imposed sanctions like from 2017, I would say that's more about these things, but these were responses to things that happened before those sanctions, like the last sanctions, which were I don't know. Like I said, I don't know when they did the drug trafficking, but I'm sure that's somewhere in between. Following first section of sanctions. Oil sanctions hit Venezuela's main revenue stream, worsening economic hardship. Recent enforcement has included aggressive measures like tanker seizure and blockades. Now, I will say this. The whole oil war thing, it doesn't make sense. Because in the United States, I used to do stocks. I used to trade stocks every day. Like the last year that I did stocks, which I believe was in 2021, my total amount of trades was almost $1 million. So I almost made $1 million doing trades in the stock market in 1 year in 2021. That was the highest I ever did, and I never did stocks after the. I try to get into that because it does relate to this. Um, so the United States has sanctions on oil, and I knew that when I was trading stocks because my favorite stock was Chevron stock. And now Chevron is a very interesting thing because Chevron is the only. So I don't remember, but I remember that either it was once every year or once every 3 years, where they would have to have the U.S. government renew the licenses for Chevron to do business with Venezuela. They were the only corporation that could actually transport oil to the United States, to Texas, to Southeast Texas, with oil tankers. So, hang on. I had to answer somebody. So let me give it my stickies. Sorry about that bouncing noise. My table was not quite even. So it said, can you explain the Chevron relationship with Venezuela for the YouTube audience? Which I'm pretty much saying that for someone who might not know what's going on with Venezuela. So let's dumb it down a little bit. Absolutely. Here is a YouTube-friendly explanation of the Chevron-Venezuela relationship. Chevron's in Venezuela's the oil story. Why Chevron is in Venezuela's oil industry. Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves in the world. Most of it heavy crude that needs special tech to produce and refine. I tell you this, in the United, I was probably going to mention this, but I know that in Southeast Texas, we're one of the only in Port Arthur on the coast. They're the only ones that can produce this particular crude. Yeah, there's like sweet crude, there's sour crude, there's different grades of crude. I think sweet crude is from Iran, and sour crude is from what they process in on the coast of Texas. I think that's true. It might be swapped. Actually, we're gonna open a new thing. And what's in? Does Iran have sweet crude or sour crude? Iran primarily produces sour crude oil, meaning it has relatively high sulfur content compared to sweet crude. I think they can produce. I think they can process both of them. Um, it's really one of the few places that can. What crude can Port Arthur, Texas process? Port Arthur, especially the Motiva refinery, can produce a wide range of crudes, including heavy sour crude like Middle Eastern and Venezuelan grades, as well as lighter sweet crudes, thanks to its deep conversion coking capacity. Uh, yeah, um, there's Motiva, there's Valero, there's Texaco, um, and then there's Exxon, which is in Beaumont. And Exxon does sour crude. They're, but yeah, I used to live about a mile or two away from Motiva. Um, so yeah, that's a fun fact about Texas that you may or may not have probably not have heard that before. So, anyways, um, so yeah, there Port Arthur can process the crudes from Venezuela. Chevron is the Chevron is the only major U.S. oil company still operating there, partly because it accepted Venezuela's rule that the state oil company PDVSA must always control a majority share. Chevron works through joint ventures with PDVSA rather than owning oil fields outright. A long and complex history. Chevron's presence in Venezuela goes back about a century, tracing back to Gulf oil in the 1920s. Nationalizations and politics. In the 1970s, Venezuela nationalized the oil industry, creating state oil company PDVSA. Or PDVSA. Maybe. I don't know. By the 2000s, under Hugo Chavez, foreign oil companies had to give up control to PDVSA or face expropriation. Exxon and Conoco left. Chevron agreed to the new terms and stayed. Conoco does not work in... not that I'm aware of. I've lived in Southeast Texas for about... I mean, I was born there. But I lived there for about... What is it? 15 to 20 years? I think Conoco might have in the 90s, but I don't know. I know that they don't do anything as far as I'm aware. I've never seen their stuff over there. I think they might have been even bought out by Texaco. Conoco, I don't know. There was a lot of that stuff going on as well. Anyways, Venezuela's oil industry fell into crisis due to economic mismanagement and U.S. sanctions, but Chevron's case has been unique. Chevron's special status. While broad U.S. sanctions restricted Venezuela's oil exports and financial activity, Chevron received special licenses, at times allowing it to keep some operations going. And these things, like I said, they get renewed. I think it's once every one year or once every 3 years. It's either one or the other. I don't remember. It's been a while. Like I said, it was that was about 3 years ago since I've traded Chevron. These licenses changed depending on U.S. policy. Under the Biden administration, Chevron was allowed to export some oil again. Later, the license was revoked and then changed again under the Trump administration. Yeah, this must have happened. I don't know when that would have happened, but I think that might have been some big news. But yeah, Chevron was one of my favorites. I would day trade Chevron. However, when the Ukraine war started, people were telling me, get into Chevron, because their stock prices are going through the roof because of the gas prices and all that going on with Ukraine. And, I didn't get involved in any of that. I did not want to make money off a war like that. I just, even if I made a little bit of money, how would that help Ukraine? So I wasn't involved in any of that. It says how Chevron's involvement works. Under current arrangements, Chevron doesn't own the oil, PDVSA does. Chevron gets a share of production from joint ventures. Chevron also has been allowed to export Venezuelan crude to the United States, giving U.S. Gulf Coast refineries, that's what I just said, giving U.S. Gulf Coast refineries like Port Arthur, refineries heavy oil they need, which is what was it, sour crude? through output and exports have fluctuated. Though output and exports have fluctuated with sanctions and political shifts. Why it matters and why it's controversial. That might have something to do with the said. That might, with the reduction of Venezuela, I wonder if that has something to do with the Keystone Pipeline. But I don't think. What crude oil does Alaska have? I think it's the same as ours. Yeah, that's right. It's the same as ours. It's sweet crude, which is why it goes directly to Port Arthur. Um, what kind of crude does Alaska have for Keystone? Uh, the XL Keystone permanent term for Alaska crude. It was honestly oil crude. That's where you get the fracking from. You gotta go. That's what they used. Very heavy crude that's mixed with. Yeah, it's fracking like crude. It says it's heavy. I could have sworn it was like I thought it was like the same as ours in Port Arthur. Now, not that we could process, like I said, it could process a lot of crude. So, yeah. Controversial. Economic and political stakes. Looking at my time there. Venezuela desperately needs oil revenue. Chevron's operations help restore production after years of decline and sanctions. Some analysts see this as a partial lifeline for Venezuela's economy. So when you do trading Chevron, you're actually, you could say you're kind of helping in a way with the economy. But critics argue that Chevron's presence, especially under certain U.S. sanctions policies, helps the government accused of repression keep exporting oil, potentially undermining pressure of Nicolas Maduro. But he would get his money elsewhere. I don't understand. I don't understand the. I don't know. I mean, a lot of this is a lot of surface level. They're looking at the economy. They're not looking at the deeper stuff. You know, they're not looking at the drug trafficking. They're not looking at all that stuff. They're looking at where the money flows and how they can make money. So you really have to keep that in mind when you're doing stuff like this as well. Geopolitics. Because Chevron is the only U.S. major still there, and U.S. sanctions made oil trade complicated, its role becomes political as well as economic, caught between U.S. policy goals and Venezuela's need for production. That's seen as both pragmatic, maintaining some production, and controversial, appearing to favor corporate interests. Yeah. So, there's probably some stuff you didn't know. I do want to say one thing, and this relates to the future of the United States as well. So, this is kind of a tangent, but it relates to what happens to some democratic countries. And we'll post it here on the thing. I don't know where this term came from. I think I looked it up before, but I don't remember. But the term they use is a fortress state. In certain situations, not every, but in certain situations, when you have a democracy would turn eventually into a fortress state. It doesn't happen to everyone. It's like looking at a star. What star do you think turns into a supernova? Which one turns into a black hole? Which one implodes? Which one collapses? You don't know until it happens. You can kind of theorize due to the mass of the star, and if it has a very heavy mass, it would collapse. But if it doesn't have, like, the gravity around it implodes based on the mass in the star, if it can't sustain itself, it's going to implode on itself instead of spread out. So, and what happens in democracies, depending on their I don't know what you would call it, but Venezuela was very strong on democracy, and you could theorize that the future of the United States, even though we're not democratic like that, we do have a major size and a major influence, which could act as a way to implode into a fortress state. And that's what I would classify the future of the United States as being. It says, in a sentence, what is a fortress state? That's when your government takes over. I'm not talking about the democratic government, which, and I still gotta make this video. We're not talking about the United States government. The United States government is federal, but not everything in the United States government is democratic. Well, they're not Democrat either. Not all Democrat either, but you have the federal government, which sustains and stabilizes everything. So let's go by what a definition of a. Am I still on here? Yeah. So Alice is working. All right. So I'm gonna have ChatGPT explain it in a sentence. In a sentence, what is a fortress state? That means that nothing comes in, nothing goes out. A fortress state is a country that prioritizes strict border control, internal security, and self-sufficiency, often isolating itself from the outside world to protect its political system, economy, and ruling power from external influence. Now, you hear this term by Democrats and liberals on some sources, not like mainstream news. I haven't seen it in mainstream. You might have heard it, but I've only seen it so far in non-mainstream news. And people are saying that Trump is creating a fortress state. President would not be able to do that. You would have to have a government that's powerful enough to pretty much overrule everybody. It wouldn't be a democratically elected president. Now, you could argue, well, was Trump actually democratically reelected? I would say by all the perception and all the beliefs that the Americans have, they would say that they did. Even the Republicans would say we did vote democratically for Trump. So it wasn't like it was federally selected. Venezuela is a fortress state because its government controls everything. But just because your government controls everything doesn't mean that it's a fortress. You have to be, although it's a mix here because the United States does block things, but also Venezuela doesn't really know how to really expand outside except oil. So it's not as diverse as America would be. But if you're talking about all this America First stuff, keeping things self-sufficient, putting tariffs on foreign countries, you're creating a system where you can isolate yourself from the rest of the world, but at the same time, it works both ways, where the rest of the world isolates you from them, or them from you, and it builds stronger alliances for them, and it removes alliances for yourself. So you see the trajectory of the United States in that case. you give them the cards because then when another president comes along, they say, well, we don't want to do business with you anymore. Our alliances are strong, and we don't want to play these games. So, yeah, you know. Now, when we talk about, now I want to be clear on my wording here. I asked, could America become a fortress state? When you're talking about this kind of stuff, you won't be saying the United States of America becomes a fortress state. You would say America becomes a fortress state because it becomes unified through a system ran by the federal government. And you would have one for one, and you wouldn't be electing anybody, it would be full control. So let's see what ChatGPT. I don't know what it's going to say here. Could say yes, could say no. But both could be. We don't know until it happens, right? But I can already tell you that if a federal government knows about this stuff, they can definitely use this. I said, anyway, I'll repeat. Could America become a fortress state? It says yes, America could become a fortress state, but only partially and by choice. Not overnight and not in the classic stood-up dictatorship sense. The reason it would be partially is because America is in between two other countries, Mexico and Canada. So it wouldn't be completely blocked out from the rest of the world. You'd still be able to do, but for everyone else out beyond the ocean, you won't be able to do anything with them. It says by choice. Could it be by choice? If you're talking about Trump and his policies, I guess you could say that. But a fortress state would happen when there is a takeover, and it would happen not overnight. Actually, it would not actually happen overnight. It would happen in a day. Just in a few, about 10 minutes. Or let's say about 30 to 45 minutes. The amount of time it takes for the United States flag to come down and a certain other flag to go up, I'm not going to say what flag that is, but one flag must go down, one flag must go up in its place, and that's a fortress state. You will not have a choice in that. And that would be due to circumstances of what's going on. In practice, it would look like this. Tighter borders, heavier control over trade and technology, more internal surveillance and security framing. This would be the federal government work. This would not be a democracy. Because you don't vote for these things. You don't vote for... You could vote for tighter borders. You don't really vote for heavier control over trade and technology. That would also, if you have your control of trade and technology, what would actually happen is they would actually take technology for other countries, and then they would build an alliance based on the technology you refuse to export. Which is something that's been building in Ukraine since 2015. So we're sending all of our stuff over there. Google, Oracle, Apple since, I think it was like 2022. After the war started, they haven't made any buildings over there as far as I know, but I know that they are getting more into the Ukrainian influence. There's more internal surveillance, you're not voting for that. And security framing, not voting for that. Reduce global commitments. You're probably not voting for that. You could vote for that, but who would really vote for? I mean, it depends if you believe in a America First policy and a stronger emphasis on domestic self-sufficiency. energy, manufacturing food. That's more of a belief system than something you could actually vote for. That's a more a perception thing. So if we believe that we're self-sufficient, we're going to be more self. But still, a belief isn't going to be reality. You can believe that, but that doesn't mean that's necessarily true. You could believe that and see the prices going down on things, but that doesn't necessarily mean the case. This is just how markets work. You already see pieces of this in debates over border enforcement, supply chain restoring, sanctions, export controls on tech, and rhetoric about economic nationalism. It sounds kind of like the same stuff they're talking about with Venezuela. They said we're doing it to ourselves. It's self-imposed sanctions on ourselves. A tariff is at a really deep down sense, is a sanction against the importer and not the exporter. Tariff goes against the exporter, but it's like a self-imposed sanction on the importer, right? Make sense? What makes the U.S. different in scale and structure? A full fortress state requires centralized authority, long-term public buy-in, willingness to absorb economic pain from isolation. America's open economy, federal system, there it is, federal system, and cultural resistance to sustained sacrifice make total isolation unlikely. However, I will say this. Its economy, if you have certain, again, it's about circumstances. In variables in this case. Our economy, you can change a flag and say, hey, we're not going to do business anymore. Because once you do that, once you have a regime change in the United States, no one does business with the United States. So like, what the hell is going on, right? Your money goes down. You don't have no currency at that time. Your entire thing goes upside down and you become America first. You're going to have to go, your money is going to be useless when that happens. And you think, well, how could that be? Well, because the main money that America makes is not from the internal, it's from the external, it's from your imports and exports. Think of it like this. If you shut down the United States, you don't have tariffs, you don't have sanctions, you don't have a way to make money from other countries if you push them out of your, if you give them, if you impose a tax, if you will, on export coming to America, you could just, you get rid of the ability to make money on tariffs. It says cultural resistance. If you were to impose it today, yes. If the government said, let's change the flag right now, yeah, you would have cultural resistance. So it's all about timing. You got to do it at the exact right time. And you got to do that when there's a lot of distress going on. There's a lot of distrust. There's wars going on between politics, like real violent wars going on between politics. A lot of that, a lot of chaos, like pretty much like Venezuela. And people say, well, look at the fall of democracy. When you get to that point, you don't have cultural resistance. You have disparity. The more realistic outcome is a hybrid. Fortress-like in borders, finance, and technology, while selectively engaged where it benefits power over stability. And we're already in this right now. We are a hybrid right now. But are we in a hybrid permanently, or are we in a hybrid because we're transitioning to a fortress state? There's really not a way to gauge when that's starting. You kind of have to read in between lines of what's going on and say, well, things getting, what's actually going on in politics. And I'm not just saying look at the president. I'm talking about what are the government officials saying. What is, really pay attention. And are we going into a fortress state, or are we really a hybrid? So pay attention to what people are talking about. Pay attention to what people are saying. And if we all go into a fortress state, the government will give opportunities to allow people to evacuate if they can see that happening. Of course, the federal government is going to say, "Oh no, this is when people evacuate, like they're going to see all these people are going to question why are people evacuating, where are people going, and they're going to say, these are just outcasts of the country. These are not nationalists. They're going to another country. They're going to destroy that country, and you don't want to get involved with that because they're just going to destroy. They might be going to Europe. They're going to destroy Europe. These are the deplorables, I guess you could say, of citizens that don't believe in their country. These are people who would not loyal to their country. They're not patriots. They would leave because they can't handle it. When it's all just a word to make sure that they have citizens in this fortress state. So you want to pay attention to what people are saying. I haven't seen anything that points to that today, besides Trump, of course. But outside of what Trump says, there's nothing like that going on right now. We have tariffs, we have exports, we don't have anything imported. We don't have anything exported going to other countries. So that's a big key. While still selectively engage where it benefits power and stability, the federal government is always going to say that it's having stability, and anyone who leaves is going to be unstable, and they're going to create those problems to another country. And they're going to say that this makes our country stronger. Be careful of those words. If there was a federal government that tells you that you stay, you just being there makes a country stronger, you might want to be careful. Because it makes them more powerful and not you. It takes your power away from yourself, and it just comes bad. It says the real risk isn't walls, it's fragmentation. When internal division pushes the country to harden inward because governing outward becomes too costly. That's kind of like what I just said. When internal division pushes the country to harden inward, and when people are feeling hot, when people sense that, they're going to leave. Because governing outward becomes too costly, and they can't bring those people back. They don't have any ability to bring them back. When they leave, they're gone. And you just gotta, and other countries will create incentives to bring more people in. So it pushes America into a transition of a stronger and stronger country, while simultaneously giving more power to the federal government, and it removes democracy. So, foreshadowing, lessons of the future. It says, if you want, I can answer this from a historical comparison angle. Rome, Britain, late USSR, in a future scenario angle, what triggers it and what stops it. What stops it? We can't stop it once you gotta finish transition. But once it happens, you gotta play on the perceptions of people. You gotta make sure that there's a change. You gotta give them something to look at. It says, why is this different than what? How do we know that we're not being played right now? And sorry, so you gotta play on people's perceptions, and not. You kind of have to like do a reverse manipulation because you'd have to do something that the federal government wouldn't do, and they couldn't control it. Now that's very hard to do because they could make you believe anything, right? So how do you know it's a lie? How do you know it wouldn't have to be authoritarianism, but it wouldn't be a dictatorship. I mean, actually, it wouldn't be authoritarianism. It would be a dictatorship, but not all dictatorships are. 99.99% of the time, dictatorships are bad. But for the very, very small few, there was at least one, I don't remember what it was, but and I don't know if it's true or not, but there was one country that did have a benevolent dictator. He was called the benevolent dictator. Benevolent dictator. It's an hour so far doing this video. Singapore is often cited as having a benevolent dictator, Lee Kuan Yew, who ruled with authoritarian control while delivering long-term stability, economic growth, and low corruption. Singapore actually has problems because I forget what's going on in Singapore at the moment. I think they're definitely more progressive, but I don't know what year it's talking about regarding this. You guys can Google that. In fact, you can I'm gonna make a video about that. Actually, we could talk about that in a future video. Seems interesting. But yeah, I think it was another country. I think it was a country in Africa that had a benevolent dictator. It might be him though. But yeah, I'll end it here, and yeah. So I hope that you understand what. Let me think if there was something came to me. Oh, I did want to talk about something else. There was talk about the Maduro's transportation. I think they said his wife also came with him. This is very unusual because why would you put someone on a plane? Whenever the United States puts someone on a plane, even Russia did this. When you put someone on a plane, you're giving them an evacuation. That's a symbol of evacuation. It's not. It's a rescue thing. So, what does that mean? Like, what is the signal you're sending when people say it's kidnapped, but not really, because it looks like it's hard to find information on this. I mean, there's so much stuff about it, and a lot of it is from Democrats saying, "Oh, we kidnapped them, sovereign country, all this," but that really doesn't make any sense because you wouldn't kidnap someone in a military. I think it was a military. Probably a military helicopter. You wouldn't evacuate. You wouldn't kidnap somebody, put them in prison, unless your life was in danger, or there was I don't know, a distress signal of some kind. That's what I would say. That's because that's not usual to have someone let's say escorted by the U.S. government to come to the United States, go into a prison, just to be, you gotta, there's something there, it just doesn't make sense. Another thing is sovereign, the word sovereign. People were saying, well, Venezuela is a sovereign country. It's independent on this. Let's get real here. Sovereign does mean that you're a country that operates on your own, and you have a name, you have no one above you, you have no equals, you're by yourself. But given the state of the economy and the sanctions and how it can't regulate itself, sovereignty doesn't mean independence in this case. So I would not. The word sovereign does not match all interpretations when you use that word when you're talking about Venezuela. I mean, it's kind of like saying, well, Crimea is sovereign. Um, but it's so heavily impacted by sanctions that could you really say it's sovereign? Because in the United States, we use sovereignty means independent. It's not independent. You say well, it can make its own laws and all that, but you're being forced to do things like the drug trafficking and all that because of sanctions. I mean, we didn't go through that. I'm assuming that's the case. So yeah, you're being controlled by a third party. Now that's a completely different situation than sovereignty. The other problem is in European countries the word sovereign means kingsmanship. Do you think Venezuela is a king of its area? No, because the United States. In that particular case, the United States would be the king of Venezuela. And there was also talk about Cuba being influenced to Venezuela. I think that's a very moot point. Maybe politically, but if you're talking about economically and the big picture, Cuba doesn't really. I mean, they might. I mean, I'm sure that they do coincide with each other, but I don't think that's a really big thing, especially considering how they're they are separated by ocean. Now, if there was landlocked, then it might be a different story. But outside of politics, there's really nothing you could really do. Now what I've heard, and we didn't look into this. I don't know much about Venezuela besides what we just read here, but I heard that there was like Russians and Chinese all in Venezuela. And they were saying, well, they might be influencing politics and all this. I mean, so I don't understand the whole Venezuela thing, what's going on. It doesn't align to what we've read here. It doesn't align to, I mean, the only thing I can plausibly make sense in my mind is that it was to protect this this guy who was president there. And Trump's language is always about, we're going to get the bad guys, we're going to get the bad guys. Well, I think that might just be telling people something to say, we're doing good here, when the reality is the guy possibly sent a distress signal, or there was something in the United States government that said, hey, the president, something's going to happen, there's going to be a coup attempt or something, and you need to get out of power, because if they kill you, it's going to cause a bigger problem if they get away with it. And there was some sort of negotiation or something about that. That's what I think happened. I don't know for sure, but it's just the only thing that really makes sense in the situation, because otherwise, why are they care if they got these sanctions going on? They say, what's drug trafficking? I mean, that can all be a show for the public, for the Americans, where they can fight politically for that. But that's what I would say. I would say that it was to save them from like an attempted coup. So there's gonna be and they've even talked about one of the woman who won the Nobel Peace Prize, something like that, and they want her. They say that she's gonna be the next elected president, next democratically elected president. That's strange, because if it's the next democratically elected president, then how would you know that in advance? Which tells me that it's not going to be democratically elected and there's going to be a coup attempt. Just by looking at the language, that's what I can make out of it. So, we'll see. So, I see you guys in the next video. I'm gonna finish here. Hopefully I am going to be doing more videos. At the date of this that I'm doing this video, I have unlisted all of my videos since prior to, I think, January. I think there was a video that I uploaded yesterday. If not, it's today, which is January 5th. But every video before this, that one, it's been unlisted. So if the videos are still unlisted, then that's the reason why. Also, the Comic Con website has been deleted. I deleted it. So I've unlisted the videos on YouTube, and I've deleted the Comic Con website. Uh, I just a lot of stuff has happened, and with me personally, nothing involving any government or anything like that. No YouTube takedown, nothing like that. It's just this is a lot to handle when you realize what's going on. Sometimes, well, I'll tell you what happened. So before January 1st, I was thinking about deleting, well, not deleting my YouTube channel, but unlisting all my videos, getting rid of everything, because it's very hard mentally sometimes, especially during this year, to do this. It's not because I'm burned out. It's because, you know, people can say certain things, and the people who don't even watch the videos and stuff, they don't understand. They say that I don't understand something. It's only one person, but still, it's a thing. And I don't know who's lying. I don't know who's telling the truth. So I always gotta make videos the best I can. So it sometimes gets to me, and that's why you see that. I know it's like a psychological capacity, like a capacity that I have, where I gotta do that. But that's why. And the reason I did that was because I was looking for. I was trying to find something on my iPad on iCloud, and I learned, and I went through all my backups. I went through all my business stuff. It's supposed to be my business stuff. I lost all of my stuff that I copied for my mom's stuff, and it's not here, and it's been gone since May of last year. Well, May of, what was it? May of 20, was it 2026? Was it, I mean, 2025, was it last year? Yeah, it was last year, where we had the huge fire. So I lost all my stuff. I don't know why it wasn't backed up, but yeah, I lost my USB stick in that fire. I lost my Mac in that fire. Lost my MacBook in that fire. So now I lost all these pictures and all this other stuff. I had of my mom's and my grandma's on that USB. I could theoretically get them back because they're in storage. It's just that I don't have a way to bring them all here where I'm at now. And yeah, so it really bothered me. So I was like, I can't do this, and I just removed it. So I wasn't sure I was gonna even do a video today. I wasn't even planning on it. It was just a spur of the moment thing, because people, just about 30 minutes before I made this video, people were saying oil war, and I wanted to talk about Venezuela. So that's the story. So yeah. And also, I wanted to make videos. I do want to bring back the videos because, you know, my views are going to go down. The algorithm's going to get messed up. And I'm going to lose my subscribers. So I might bring them back tomorrow. I don't know. But anyways, I'll end it here, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye for now.